Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wildlife If It Was Limited Life. Yes, I'm now finally on the most recent season, and yeah, basically, here are the rules. 24 plus hours is dark green, 16 plus hours is green, 8 plus hours is yellow, and 0 plus hours is red. Here's the board 18 people on 32 hours. So, yeah. So I don't know how long each session was. Some people told me about it, some of them I kind of know, but basically we're doing a 3 hour time loss every single session because I'm lazy, but also you'll see at the end why. So session one, there was only two deaths, Pearl and Scar. So Pearl loses an hour, Scar loses an hour. So session two, we have some skin changes, and then 3 hour time loss. And yeah, let's go over some of these deaths. So, Mumbo starved, Ren starved, and Skiz starved. So, Mumbo loses an hour, Ren loses an hour, and Skiz loses an hour. Then, Pearl is blown up by a creeper, and Jimmy's also blown up by a creeper. So, Pearl loses an hour, turning her lime, and Jimmy loses an hour. Then both Martin and Skiz died of hunger. So, Martin loses an hour, and Skiz loses another hour, turning him lime as well. Then we have the first kill, which is Skiz dying to Tango because he blocked off the water. So, Skiz loses an hour, Tango gains 30 minutes. Then Cleo is killed by a skeleton, and Tango gets instant karma by dying to a creeper. And the final death of session 2 was Mumbo dying to fall damage. So, Cleo loses an hour, Tango loses an hour, and Mumbo loses an hour, turning him lime. So session 3, we have a 3 hour time loss, which turns everybody lime, which is fun. This is snail apocalypse. So let's just see it. First death is Jimmy dying to a creeper, though. So Jimmy loses an hour. Then we have a first round of snails. You'll get the reference if you watched my recap for this session. With Bigby dying to his snail, Jimmy dying to his snail, Ether dying to his snail, Tango dying to his snail, Pearl dying to her snail, B-Dubs dying to a snail twice, Scar dying to his snail, Jimmy dying to his snail again, Skiz dying to his snail, and then Scar dying to his snail again. So, Bigby loses an hour, Jimmy loses an hour, Ether loses an hour, Tango loses an hour, Pearl loses an hour, B-Dubs loses an hour, and then he loses another one. Scar loses an hour, Jimmy loses an hour, Skiz loses an hour, Scar loses an hour. Crazy. Then we have a brief break with Jimmy dying to a creeper, but then Mumbo dying to a snail by drowning. Then Ren giving his life to Jimmy. And yeah, so Jimmy loses an hour, Mumbo loses an hour, Ren loses an hour, Jimmy gains 30 minutes. And then we have ourselves more snail deaths with Skiz dying to his snail with drowning and Impulse dying to his snail. So Skiz loses an hour, Impulse loses an hour. Then we have Skiz getting his revenge on Tango, so Skiz kills him. And Martin dies to an Enderman. So Tango loses an hour, Skiz gains 30 minutes, and Martin loses an hour. Then Ren dies to a snail twice, Skiz dies to a snail, B-Dubs dies to a snail, and Impulse dies to a snail. So Ren loses an hour, another hour. Then Skiz loses an hour, B-Dubs loses an hour, and Impulse loses an hour. Then Etho dies to a creeper, Tango is killed by his snail, Impulse is killed by Ren, Martin dies to his snail, Lizzie dies to Skiz, Ren dies to his snail, Skiz dies to Jimmy, Green dies to his snail, Pearl dies to her snail, Mumbo dies to his snail, Scar dies to Skiz, Tango dies to his snail, Guard is killed finally by his snail using Ren's splash potion of invisibility. So that was a bit of a ramble, but Ether loses an hour, Tango loses an hour, Impulse loses an hour, Ren gains 30 minutes. Martin loses an hour, Lizzie loses an hour, Skiz gains 30 minutes. Ren loses an hour, Skiz loses an hour, Jimmy gains 30 minutes. Green loses an hour, Pearl loses an hour, Mumbo loses an hour, Scar loses an hour, Skiz gains 30 minutes. Tango loses an hour, Scar loses an hour, Ren gains 30 minutes. Oh boy, that was tiring. Done with the snails, guys. So session 4, we have some skin changes and a 3-hour time loss, which turns some people yellow. So yeah, that's fun. Let's go over the deaths. Ether dies to Scar, Scott dies to Mumbo, Jimmy dies to Martin, Bigby dies to a creeper, Mumbo and Green both die to Jimmy, Joel dies to Jimmy, Green dies to Scar, Mumbo kills himself, and Jem is killed by Ren. So Ether loses an hour, Scar gains 30 minutes, Scott loses an hour, Mumbo gains 30 minutes, going back to Green, Jimmy loses an hour, Martin gains 30 minutes, Bigby loses an hour, Mumbo loses an hour, turning back to yellow. Jimmy gains 30 minutes. And then Green loses an hour. Jimmy gains another 30 minutes. Then Joe loses an hour. Jimmy gains another 30 minutes, turning green. Green loses an hour. Scar gains 30 minutes. Mumbo loses an hour. And then Jem loses an hour. Ren gains 30 minutes, turning him back to green. Session 5, we have the 3-hour time loss, which turns everybody yellow. Fun. So then we have ourselves the deaths. So Cleo is killed by Mumbo. Bigby, Martin, and Jimmy die to the Ravenger. Joel dies to Tango. Scar dies to the snail bot. Lizzie dies to a creeper placed by Skiz. Bigby also dies to a creeper placed by Skiz. Cleo dies to Scar. Scott, Cleo, and Impulse all die to Martin. Pearl dies to her own end crystal, but it does kill Martin. Jem is killed by Martin. Joel is killed by Tango. Jimmy's killed by the snail. Mumbo dies twice. And Scott is killed by Pearl. So Cleo loses an hour. Mumbo gains 30 minutes. Bigby, Martin, and Jimmy all lose an hour. Joel loses an hour. Tango gains 30 minutes. Scar loses an hour. Lizzie loses an hour. Skiz gains 30 minutes. Bigby loses an hour. Skiz gains another 30 minutes. Cleo loses an hour. Scar gains 30 minutes. Scott loses an hour. Martin gains 30 minutes. Cleo loses an hour. Martin gains that as well. And Impulse loses an hour. Martin gains that. Then Pearl loses an hour. Martin loses an hour, but Pearl gets 30 minutes. Jem loses an hour. Martin gains 30 minutes. Joel loses an hour. Tango gains 30 minutes. Jimmy loses an hour. And then Mumbo loses 2 hours. And Scott loses an hour. Pearl gains 30 minutes. So session 6, Bigby changes skin back, not really that important though. We have the 3-hour time loss and turns Mumbo red. Because, as you know, Mumbo was eliminated. But he's still alive. So, let's go over the deaths. Lizzie was killed by Jimmy. Jem was killed by Skiz. Lizzie was killed by Vex. Skiz was killed by Bigby. Bigby was killed by a Vindicator. Scar was killed by a Vex. Ether was killed by a skeleton. Skiz was killed by Martin. Jimmy was killed by Bloop. Martin was killed by Lizzie. Lizzie was killed by Bigby. Skiz was killed by Tango. Eliminating Skiz, technically, but not really. So Lizzie loses an hour. Jimmy gains 30 minutes. Jem loses an hour. Skiz gains 30 minutes. Lizzie loses an hour. Skiz loses an hour. Bigby gains 30 minutes. Bigby loses an hour. Scar loses an hour. Ether loses an hour. Skiz loses an hour, turning him red. Martin gains 30 minutes. Jimmy loses an hour, turning him red. Martin loses an hour. Lizzie gains 30 minutes. Lizzie loses an hour. Bigby gains 30 minutes. And Skiz loses an hour. Tango gains 30 minutes. So session 7, we have a 3-hour time loss, which turns everybody red. Fun. So I did a poll on my channel asking you guys what to do with the zombie deaths, and it was somewhat split, but eventually, not counting zombie deaths won, so we're not counting zombie deaths. Even though it would be funny, it's just not worth it, because people would not like how I do it. So let's just go over session 7 deaths. Scar died to Green's dripstone. Green died to fall damage. Green died to Mumbo. B-Dubs died to Scar. Jem died to Scott. And Cleo died to Green. Then Ren died to Mumbo. B-Dubs died to Ren. Morton died to Scar. Scott died to Scar. Tango died to Mumbo. Joel died to Mumbo. Tango died to Morton. And Morton died to himself. Pearl died to Joel. Scott also died to Joel. And Ren died to Mumbo. Scar loses an hour. Green gains 30 minutes. Turning it back to yellow. Then green loses an hour, going back to red. Then green loses another hour. Mumbo will not gain any time. B-dubs loses an hour. Scar gains 30 minutes. Gem loses an hour. Scott gains 30 minutes, going back to yellow. Clue loses an hour. Green gains 30 minutes. Ren loses an hour. B-dubs loses an hour. Ren gains 30 minutes. Morton loses an hour. Scar gains 30 minutes. Scott loses an hour, going back to red. Scar gains 30 minutes. Tango loses an hour. Joel loses an hour. Tango loses another hour. Morton gains 30 minutes. Morton loses an hour. Pearl loses an hour. Joel gains 30 minutes. Scott loses an hour. Joel gains another 30 minutes, nearly going back to yellow. And Ren loses an hour. So, yeah. So, session 8, we made it. We got Mortren and a 3-hour time loss. And, yeah, let's just see what happens. So, Bigby dies to a snail. Jim dies to Etho. Etho dies to his snail. Impulse dies to his snail, but Joel splashed with invisibility. Scar dies to his snail, and Lizzie and Jimmy die to green. So, Bigby loses an hour, Gem loses an hour, Etho gains 30 minutes. Etho loses an hour, Impulse loses an hour, Joel gains 30 minutes. Scar loses an hour, Lizzie loses an hour, Green gains 30 minutes. Jimmy loses an hour, Green gains another 30 minutes. And, yeah. So now we have the final, well, everybody's still alive in this. The final 11. Impulse dies to Etho, Joel dies to Scott, and Scott dies to Etho. So, Impulse loses an hour, Etho gains 30 minutes, Joel loses an hour, Scott gains 30 minutes, then Scott loses an hour, Etho gains 30 minutes. Now everybody's red in wildlife. Let's do this. Gem dies to a Vex, Etho dies to his own trap, B-dubs dies to Tango, and Tango dies to Joel. So, Gem loses an hour, Etho loses an hour, B-dubs loses an hour, Tango gains 30 minutes. Then Tango loses an hour, Joel gains 30 minutes. Now we have the final 5, even though everybody's still alive. So, Pearl dies to Green, Cleo dies to Joel, and Ren dies to Joel. So, Pearl loses an hour, Green gains 30 minutes. Cleo loses an hour, Joel gains 30 minutes. Ren loses an hour. Joel gains 30 minutes. And then finally, Green dies to Joel. Green loses an hour. Joel gains 30 minutes. And then Joel dies. Joel loses an hour. So for the first time ever, everybody is alive. Wow. So, in 16th place, we have Jimmy, Skiz, and Mumbo with an hour. 9th place, we have Martin, Cleo, Pearl, B-dubs, Gem, Impulse, and Scar with 2 hours. In 7th place, we have Tango and Lizzie with 2.5 hours. In 5th place, we have Scott and Bigby with 3 hours. In 3rd place, we have Etho and Martin with 3.5 hours. In 2nd place, we have Green with 4.5 hours. And in 1st place, Joel with 5.5 hours. His second win in a fictional reality. Yeah, that's it. Subscribe.